Finding all the items on your grocery list may be a challenge these days, as many stores across the nation have shelves that are virtually empty. The shortage has prompted some companies such as Aldi to issue apologies for the lack of products. The hashtag #BareShelfBiden has been trending on Twitter this week. And Dr. Anthony Cannizzaro, Associate Professor of International Business and Associate Dean of the Bush School of Business at Catholic University of America and the Director of Catholic University's New Family Business Consortium, joins us now. Dr. Cannizzaro, welcome back. Great to see you. Let's talk a little bit more about this. Myself, and I know many other Americans, have gone to the grocery store lately and found many of the shelves empty, be it paper products or produce. What do you think is driving these new shortages?
Well, it's actually a multifaceted phenomenon. You're right. We've had the shortages here as well. I'll note before we get into it that all of the shelves aren't empty. We see, probably 2 to 3 times the normal stock out rates right now, but that's enough to sort of be visible when we walk into the store. We've seen this especially among staple foods. Probably the ones that have received the most attention are things like baby formula, meat, and even pet food. The primary driver continues to be our supply chains, and this is for several reasons. We have continued labor shortages, either with employees being out sick or unable to work due to COVID regulations. But mostly we have issues upstream in the supply chain. So still so many blockages at our ports and problems in our interior infrastructure, shipping supplies through trucks and whatnot. So you can consider this. Pre-pandemic, the cost of shipping goods between here and, say, China was about $2,000. Now it's anywhere between 8 and 10 times that. I think the last I checked, there are over 100 ships outside the port of Los Angeles, which is a record high.
Wow. Another thing I'm going to talk about is truckers. By the end of January, here in the U.S., all truck drivers I know will have to show proof of vaccination. What issues do you think that could cause, not just for domestic truck drivers, but also those truck drivers coming over from Mexico or Canada? And what impact could that have on the supply chain?
Well, so this is a problem that I think can't be understated, right? So once supplies get into the United States, truck travel is still one of our primary sources of getting goods, both across the country, but then to the end point where it's distributed to consumer. So this represents a major potential risk in the supply chain. And as you said, the truck drivers that cross borders are probably one of our largest concerns right now. The United States and Canada that you mentioned are our 2 largest trading partners. And according to some data that's coming out of Canada, they estimate about 20% of Canadian truck drivers are not vaccinated, and 40% of U.S. drivers that cross the border are not vaccinated. So that's a tremendous amount of disruption in the flow of goods across those borders.
Yeah, and how long do you think this will last? I mean, how long will it take to kind of correct the supply chain?
It is really difficult to say. I think it's a fair bet, whatever happens, we're not going to go back to a supply chain that looks like what we had pre-pandemic. We operated in very thin inventories, and we kept all our eggs in just a few baskets. The biggest, of course, was China. That kind of dependence doesn't make for a resilient supply chain. And so it's, in the face of massive global shocks, it's not something that we want to recreate. So at the end of the day, probably it's not going to be until regulations allow people to get back to work so that businesses can respond to these shortages that we're really going to see what this new normal is going to look like.
Yeah, and it's not just shortages, as you know, that's the only problem facing our economy right now. Now we have about 7% inflation, a high that hasn't been seen since the 80s. Can you quickly talk to us about that? And when do you think we'll see prices level off?
Well, so these are actually very related issues, right? So the Wall Street Journal is reporting that labor shortages, inflation, and supply chain problems now rank above COVID as the primary concerns sort of weighing on U.S. corporate executives, right? So inflation is a bigger concern than COVID. And what that means for us is that we have to wait for the private sector to be able to sort of normalize for all of this to come back down. It's really difficult to project how quickly prices will return to normal. It's not going to be until we have a sort of a private sector solution.
Well, Dr. Canizar, thank you so much for weighing in. I wish we had better news, but hopefully next time.
All right. Thank you so much for having me.